What's up guys? So today we have this Switch motherboard again. This is a Switch donor board that we've been working on the channel to repair. You might be able to tell, but the board is a little bit bent and this ripped pads underneath the RAM area and the APU area. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the most difficult part of the repair process of a board like this, which will consist of not only repairing the microscopic BGA pads on the board itself, but also on the APU itself of the Switch, because there's some ripped pads underneath the APU itself in that same area. Now, this is arguably the most time-consuming and difficult portion of a repair like this, but to be honest with you, it's one of my favorite things to do. I honestly have a lot of fun with trace repair, and it's always satisfying getting a device working after repairing a bunch of traces. So let's dive into how we would go about fixing some of these BGA pads on the board itself first. First thing I recommend doing is throwing a board like this in a board holder. That way, while you're doing trace repair on the really tiny pads, it's not rocking the board around on your mat. Cool, so that's not going anywhere. All right, so here are all of the ripped pads underneath the APU. You can see there's quite a few of them. So in situations like this, what I like to do is go row by row and figure out which pads we need to repair. I'll have a link in the description to the video where I go about how to identify different types of pads. But very quickly, just as a recap, we have three kinds of pads here. We have pads like this that are obviously connected to a trace and are going somewhere. In this case, this one's going over to the memory. We have pads like this, which are no connects, which have nothing underneath the pad, indicating that it was connected to anything at all. And we also have no trace around the pad area. So in cases like this, we can just ignore this pad and move on. And then we have instances like this where we have a via in the middle of the pad like these, and these pads are going down to other layers of the board, so they are connected to something. And again, just because there's a trace or via connected to the pad doesn't necessarily mean it's required for the console to be working, because it may be a redundant pad and it also may be a ground pad. So this top pad up here, we're going to use a multimeter in diode mode, and we're going to put the red probe on ground. I'm just going to put it on the USB-C port area over here. And then we can use the black probe to probe this scraped up trace here. And you can see we're getting about a 0.36 voltage drop from that trace. So that's going to be one that we definitely want to repair. It's not ground, and it's very likely a data line going over to the RAM area. So that's going to be marked for repair. This one here appears to be empty. There's no via in the middle of it. We can zoom in just to double check. But yeah, that's looking like a no connect to me. So very unlikely something that we need to repair. Let's proceed with these other pads here. Okay, that's ground, so we can skip that one. And that's also ground, so we can also skip that. Again here, another one that is a no connect. So far, out of the 5 pads we've looked at, only one of them actually needs to be repaired. With these other 4 here, we can just throw some solder mask on them and call it a day. Let's continue. We have this one here. This is giving about a 0.33 voltage drop there, so we're definitely going to want to replace that. What about this one? All right, that's also ground, so we can skip that one. This is almost certainly going to give us a reading, 0.32, so that one needs to be repaired. These 3 here are no connects, so we can skip them. Let's check this here, 0.32, okay. And we should check this one here next, but I haven't scraped up the trace here, so I'll show you how I go about doing that. All right, so I've zoomed in a bit here, and it's important to note that these traces here, unlike this one and this one, are really thin, so they're going to be pretty sensitive, and it's going to be easy to rip more of this off the board if we're not careful. So I highly recommend you don't use something like the grinding pen in cases like this, because first of all, here's like the smallest tip attachment that I can find for this thing. You can see it's pretty huge in comparison to the size of the trace, and you're very likely going to either tear through the trace as a whole or tear through other traces around it, which we don't want to do. So what I like to do is just use these titanium sharp tweezers. They're super sharp. You can find these on AliExpress. I'll have links for these in the description. You can get the straight ones and you can get the bent ones like this on the left. And they are really sharp compared to other tweezers. For example, under the microscope, I'll show you, here is these precision tweezers and these mechanic tweezers in comparison to these titanium ones. I'll show you under the microscope here. So here's the normal precision tweezer. You can see it's pretty big. Here's the mechanic precision tweezer, pretty big also. So there are those two. And then here is the titanium tweezers. So you can see much sharper, and you can use these for scraping back traces like this, and it's really effective. So the way I like to do this with having the most amount of control is anchor your wrists on the corner of the table or something, and then use two hands to grab one side of the tweezers like this, and then you can anchor your fingers on the table as much as possible. So the more anchor points your hands have like this, the better. You don't want to be trying to scrape like this because you're going to be wiggling around under the microscope. It's going to be impossible to scrape exactly what you want. Anchor your wrists and all of your fingers on the board and hold one side of the tweezers with both hands like this. And that way you'll have much more precision when you go to scrape the small traces there. These traces are super tiny. Don't let the microscope fool you. It is pretty ridiculous how small these are. So again, I'm grabbing this tweezer with my thumb on my left hand and my middle finger on my right hand, anchoring as much as possible. And I'm just going to come in and touch the board to find the trace here, just like this. And then I'm going to start scraping back and forth very gently. And you can see without very much effort at all, we've already exposed a good chunk of that trace. And I can just use a Q-tip with some alcohol and clean up the solder mask that came off the board. And that is all we need. So that's perfect. Although while I'm here, what I'm going to do is scrape back a bit more of some of these other traces because we want a nice big area to solder to when we go to actually repair the traces. You don't want to solder to like a really small amount of the trace because it's easier for the solder joint to rip or for the trace itself to rip a bit more. So you can see how much control I have when my hands are anchored to the table and while using two hands to hold the tweezers. Alcohol is also a great way of seeing underneath some of these whitened pads like this. This one wasn't obvious before that it had a via underneath it, but you can see if I add some alcohol to it, it's really easy to see that this is going to another layer of the board. So that can be really helpful, and you can see very clearly the difference between this pad that has a via in it and these other pads here, which are very clearly no connects and aren't going to any via underneath them. So let me just get this alcohol out of here, and you can see it can be a lot harder to see what's going on without that alcohol. So first let's check out the one we just scraped back. That's about 0.32 voltage drop, so we're going to need to repair that. What about this? All right, that via right there is also ground. So far all of these vias are just going down to the ground layer, these four here. So we don't actually need to repair those because ground is present elsewhere on the chip for sure. For example, I know for a fact it's present here and here as well. So we can be sure the chip will have ground connection on various points underneath the APU, and we can just go ahead and ignore these via pads going down to the ground layer. All right, moving down a row, this is a no connect. What about this here? 0.33 voltage drop, so we're going to need to repair that. When I was measuring these before in the previous BGA pad related video, these were showing no reading, and that's because we didn't have the RAM on the board yet. So just be aware that if you have other components off of the board, some of these may give no reading if they go to that component, but they still might be vital for the functionality of the device. And then we know this one is ground here, so we can skip that. Moving on, let me just go ahead and scrape back some more of these. And you can see these two are examples of the pad being connected to a trace, but then the trace going to a via pretty close to the pad. So let me just go ahead and scrape this back. This one is a little bit hard to get to with the shield right next to it, so I recommend grabbing the bent tweezers like this. This makes it a lot easier to touch the board without having to get like a really weird angle going with your hands. Just take your time, do really small amounts at a time. You don't have to dig into the board really hard with your tweezers. You just want enough to scrape off tiny bits of that solder mask at a time. That's plenty. So let's go ahead and clean this up and we can get these measured. So right here, this is 0.88 voltage drop, so we're definitely going to want to repair that. This one still isn't giving me any reading for whatever reason. I am curious about that. So let's take a look at the board view. So even though we don't have schematics, we do have these nice board layer scans that the community has put together. Again, huge shout out to these guys for putting this together. I'll have a link for this tool in the description. It allows you to travel through the layers of the board and see where the traces are going. So in our case, let's just zoom in and try to find the pad we were looking at. I don't think this is going to be a one-to-one because this is a V1 and I think the scans are from a V2 switch, but I'm pretty sure the pads themselves are going to be going to similar places. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 from the right. So let's go back to here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you can see this is a pretty similar pad with a via right next to it. even though it's not exactly the same as our pad right here. But again, pretty similar. So let's travel through the layers of the board here and see where this via goes. I'm not going to look at this pad, I'm going to look at this because this is where it's going to start traveling through the board. So we can see here's the via still, not going anywhere yet. And here we go. Now it's finally going somewhere. So we can try to follow this thing down and around here. We can see it's on another via here. So let's see if this goes down or up. I think this is going down because if I go up, there's just a ground plane here. So let's go down and you can see it's going to this pad here, through the board, over to this, which we can travel through to here. And we can see barely still that there's a via here. I see, okay, this is very cool. So these are actually just test points. We're on the back side of the board now. It's kind of confusing because this is a mirror image of the backside, but it's because we traveled through from the front. But it looks like these are just test points or something. So this actually isn't an important pad to be repairing in our case. So I'm just going to go ahead and not bother repairing that pad because it's very clearly actually not connected to anything as we measured with our meter and as we saw with the board scans. All right, and finally, these next two are no connects, and then this one here is going to a via, which I'm going to guess is ground. And yeah, it is ground. So we're in luck here because we really only need to repair a handful of these pads. The only ones that matter are the ones going to actual traces. All of the other ones are either no connects or are vias going down to the ground plane. But what I might do is fix one of those ground vias anyways, just to show you guys how I would go about fixing one of those. So for fun, I'll go ahead and fix this bottom right pad here with the via in it, and then we can put solder mask on the rest of these. So before we put solder mask on the pads that don't need to be repaired, let me just go ahead and give this area of the board a nice clean with some 99% isopropyl. You don't want there to be flux or things like that on the board where you're putting the solder mask, or else it won't adhere correctly to the board. So here's the solder mask I use. It's the Mechanic green solder mask. What I recommend doing with this is pushing out just a little bit from the tip of the syringe. That right there is more than enough. And I'm gonna grab my X-Acto knife like this and take just a little bit on the tip of the X-Acto, and we can go ahead and wipe the rest of this off. So I'll put this down for 2 seconds here, and I'm just gonna wipe this. This stuff gets everywhere if you're not careful. And I really like this anchored X-Acto knife because it just lets you be very precise with where it is. So we're gonna go under the microscope here again. And with my left hand, I'm just gonna hold this sort of like pool of solder mask like this. And with my right hand, I'm gonna take my tweezers and I'm gonna dip it in the solder mask. Let me just get this in focus. You can see you really don't need a lot of this stuff. So like just that for now is plenty. You don't have to dip the whole tip of your tweezer in there, just enough like that. And then we're gonna come over to one of these pads that we need to cover with mask and just tap the area with your tweezer gently over and over, and it will kind of naturally spread out that solder mask that you dipped your tweezers into. So that right there is perfect. We don't want a big blob or a thick layer at all. We just want it to be a nice thin layer of solder mask like this. That way it properly cures. If you have too much solder mask, all the mask on the outside will cure, but all of that solder mask underneath that layer is not going to be cured and still liquid. So if you do ever need a thick amount of solder mask, you just want to do small layers at a time. So that's looking good right there. We're just gonna go ahead and do the same thing, but for these other pads here. And I can also spread these out a little bit more. Again, we don't want them to be bumps that get in the way of the APU, but as long as the bumps of solder mask aren't higher than the actual solder balls, then we're good to go. Cool, so this is looking pretty good. I'm just gonna take a dry Q-tip and pick up some of the excess here, especially on this pad here. This is where these super precision Q-tips come in handy. When you need to wipe solder mask off of like a single BGA pad, these are actually sharp enough to do that. See that? Good luck doing that with the Q-tip branded Q-tips. Perfect, so this is good to go. We're just gonna go ahead and cure this. So as far as the UV light goes that you use to cure, I highly recommend something like this one. I love this one. It's a high-powered, battery-powered UV light. I'll have a link for this one in the description, but whatever you use, make sure that it's a high wattage UV curing lamp. Don't attempt to use some crap from Amazon like this. These are not high enough wattage to properly cure the UV mask. So if you're having trouble curing UV mask with the UV light that you have, definitely grab something more high powered like this. They also sell one of these that's a bit cheaper that you just plug into USB and it's not battery powered. The other nice thing about this one is you can double press the delay here to do 60-second timer on the light, or you can press it once to do a 30-second delay, or you can just turn it on like this and leave it on for however long you want. So I usually do about 2 minutes, so we're just going to double press this and put it over the solder mask that we're trying to cure, and we'll wait for the minute. All right, so that's finished, and what I like to do before doing the second minute is just hit it with some IPA to clean up any sort of excess, and then you can see it will go to sort of a dull color like this. And then I'll just hit it another time with another 60 seconds. It's always a nice opportunity to get your workspace a little clean. And here we go. So let's take a look at what we have. Very nice. So this also just makes it a little bit more obvious as to which pads we're going to need to repair. So we really only have 7 pads that we need to repair, but I'll go ahead and repair this 8th one with the via down here so you can see how I'd go about doing that. So I have these nice little pad or trace repair things, which I love, and it comes like this, and you just open this plastic thing, and then there's also a bit of plastic on the back that's blue that you can pull back, and then you can take these out. These are really nice for like port trace repairs or any BGA style trace repairs as well. So let's just match up a sort of pad size. I think this is probably going to be the most appropriate size here. This one seems like it will be a little bit too big. So let's give this one a shot. You can see we have ones that are just individuals like this with no sort of tail. And I like to use these for repairing the little via pads. And I like to use these for repairing the ones with the traces. So this has a bit of a weird adhesive on it, and these can be kind of annoying to get out without breaking them. But I'm just going to do my best to get underneath this thing with my tweezers. And there we go. We have this one off. So let's move this over to the board. This actually might be a little big. Let's see if I pop this off onto the board. Is that looking like a good size? Yeah, that actually looks perfect. It's not bad for them to be a tiny bit bigger too than the pad itself. And this is just because we need to cover it with solder mask to fix it to the board. And that can happen too because they're so light and small, they just sort of fly away. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, God knows where that thing went. So let's just grab another one of these. We can kind of move this in the vicinity of the pad here. And this is the kind of work where you're definitely going to want a C210 style soldering iron. And let me just show you why. So here is the smallest bent conical that you'll generally get with the C245. And here is the bent conical for the C210. So this makes a big difference when you're doing stuff like BGA pad repair like this. All right, so I've got my C210 handle ready, and I'm gonna go ahead here and just scrape this a little bit more. I think we missed this when we were going back over the traces. So I'll just get a little bit more of this trace scraped to make it easier to solder the new pad to. That's looking good, and we can clean it up. And for this kind of work, I don't recommend just squirting a ton of flux onto it. I recommend just grab a tiny bit with your tweezers. We can even put some right here that we can just go ahead and like dip our tweezer in and use. And there we go. That's really all the flux we need. If you use too much flux, things float around and it's a lot more difficult to work with. So we'll be able to come in here and use this over and over. This is also where thin solder wire comes in handy. You can see this is my thin one, and here is the thick one. It can just make a bit of a difference when you're trying to tin tiny stuff like this. I got some solder on that pad next to it, but not a huge deal. We can always wick that up later. And it can help to kind of scrape where you're trying to tin a little bit. Not hard, just enough to get the solder to stick to the copper. And just to sort of see what's happening, I'm going to use some alcohol and wipe this all away. And that's nice and tinned there. You don't need like a huge glob of solder, but we can zoom in a little bit. And next we're going to need to line up the new pad. This can be a bit of a difficult task as these things don't like to behave because they're so small. It can be a bit easier using 2 separate pairs of precision tweezers to kind of push them around like you have little hands. Trying to grab these with the tweezers generally doesn't get you very far, and you'd be surprised with how much control you have over small components and things like this with just 2 little tweezer points like this. So what I'm trying to do is get this lined up, and ideally once it's lined up, I'm going to press downwards with my left hand, and with my right hand I'm just going to line up this in the best way possible, like that. Then we can grab some of this flux over here that we put down for ourselves, put it on the area that we want to solder. And this can be a bit tricky because you need to tin your iron with one hand. And to tin my iron, what I like to do is just have solder sort of hanging off and bent up on the roll like this. And this allows me to just come in with the iron and tin it with one hand like this. So back under the microscope, let's try to hit this with some solder. Beautiful. So we can let go now. And then to sort of get rid of this excess, we can grab this and bend it back and forth to pull it off. So now I'll go over this with some you can see there you have to be a bit careful when you're cleaning this because it just pulls off the pad. But I'm going to leave that in because that's just the reality of BGA pad repair, is everything is way too small and mistakes constantly happen. So let's try this again. Flux on your tweezers can also kind of help to stick things to the board and to the tweezers, and any amount of anchoring like that when you're working with stuff this small is massively helpful. Alright, that is looking great. Again, just going to move some flux over here, grab the iron and solder it down. Cool. And instead of making the same mistake again, what I'm going to do is grab a very soft brush and brush over this pad with some alcohol. And then again, I'm going to come in here and attempt to wiggle this back and forth to break it off. These don't take much to break off. You don't have to pull on them. You can just sort of bend it back and forth a bunch. Cool. So again, in an attempt to avoid using Q-tips, I'm just going to brush this with a very soft brush with some alcohol. And then I'll use some low temperature hot air to just evaporate things. So that's looking great. If we really want to make sure to soak up flux that might be underneath the pad or something, we can try gently using a Kim wipe like this in combination with hot air. But that is looking pretty solid to me. So next comes the solder mask. One more time. Just going to take some solder mask here and put it on the tip of my X-Acto like this, and we'll go back onto the microscope. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and then cover this entire pad along with the area that we repaired, or soldered to rather, with solder mask, just like this. Be very gentle when you're putting this down. You don't want to rip that pad up that we just worked so hard to put down. Just spread it around enough. And the solder mask is serving two purposes here. One of them is obviously to adhere the pad to the board. You saw how delicate the last one I put on was, but it also does a good job at insulating the areas of the pad that we don't want solder to go onto. So let me get this cured and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to use, again, a minute, and then we're going to clean it and then do another minute. All right, so this cured, and I'm just going to clean it with some alcohol, and then we'll cure it one more time for 60 seconds. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Next, what we're going to need to do is scrape back the solder mask where we want the pad to be showing and for the solder ball to be able to adhere to it. So what I like to do is, again, anchoring your arms on the table and using both hands on the individual side of the tweezer really helps with this. And I'm just going to start scraping in circular motions starting in the center of the pad like this. And we don't want to dig too deep because you can take off big flakes of it if you dig too deep into the pad, and we don't really want to ruin the structural integrity of the pad. So just take your time and do circular motions like this until we begin to see the copper of the pad. All right, I'm just going to clean this up so I can kind of see what I'm doing. I think I'm beginning to expose the pad underneath, but I just want to make sure that's the case. There we go. So yeah, you can see the side of it there is starting to come up. So I'll just keep going. And as it begins to come off the pad, I don't want to scrape the pad itself too much. Just want to continue scraping the solder mask. So cleaning regularly helps you see what you're doing. Cool. And you can see it will begin to kind of flake off a bit of the actual pad itself. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. And let's just double check with the multimeter in diode mode now. Red on ground and black on the pad. And you can see we are getting the 0.36 voltage drop on the top left there. So that is confirmed, connected to that trace, and it's looking beautiful. So generally I won't do all of those steps for each individual pad. I'll go ahead and scrape back all the pads like you saw me do here. And then I'll go ahead and solder all of the pads. And then I'll just do all of the solder mask at once. So that's looking perfect. I'm going to go ahead and do that for the rest of these other broken pads with the traces attached to them. And then I'll go ahead and show you how we can go about repairing the pad with the V under it like this. And by the way, I'm just using 375 on my iron. You don't really need to use high heat or anything because we are soldering super small traces. And again, scraping these a little bit can help to tin them. And also that old flux there was actually really helpful to just like stick down the pad. Really want to make sure all that flux there is removed before we put solder mask down. Cool, so that's that one done. And let's give it a test with the multimeter. 0.88, perfect. That's what it was before. And I'll go ahead and move on to doing the rest of these. So as you saw, this pad here is a original pad, but it did rip up from the board, which is common to see in areas like this. The pads that are still on the board, some of them may still be ripped partially or weakened. So we're going to want to put some solder mask over that pad as well, and then scrape back the area that we want the solder to stick to, just to provide that pad with a little bit more structure. Alright, so now that I've got all of these soldered down, I'm just going to dry the area with some low temperature hot air. And whenever I say low temperature hot air, I almost always am using 50% airspeed at like 160 degrees Celsius. It's usually a good temperature just to warm things up like flux, or to help you quickly evaporate alcohol or things like that. And as you can see, it really doesn't take a lot of solder to fix these to their respective traces. Let's just get some solder mask on these and scrape away the excess. Alright, so this is looking really solid. Next, what we're going to do is we're just going to go down here on the bottom right, and I'm going to show you how to go ahead and repair the pads that had a via under them. So even though I don't technically need to repair this one because it's ground, we can go ahead and do it anyway. So I'm just going to scrape a little bit of the substrate so we can expose the copper like that. Don't want to go too crazy, but we want some copper that we can solder to. And what we're going to do for traces like that, where it's really small and down in there to get solder to it, it's really helpful to use some solder paste, just like this, and grab a bit on your tweezers, and then we can place some right in that area. That's a bit much, so I'm going to try to grab some of that. That's fine. You can try to pick up a little bit of that with the Q-tip. Cool. So I'm going to turn up my hot air station to 350, like 60% airspeed, and just come in from the top and heat up all of that. And there we go. That's exactly what we want. If you try to use your soldering iron, what tends to happen is it just scrapes the substrate around over the point that you're trying to solder to or tin. And this, I find, is the best way to get solder in hard to reach places, is use solder paste along with some hot air. So next, we're going to look for the same sized little trace repair things, but we're just going to grab the dot this time. So I'm just going to grab one of these here, if I can manage it. Again, these can be a little tricky to get off. Let me have it. Okay, here we go. All right, and let's place this down where we want it to go. And honestly, that's kind of a lot of solder, so I'm just going to hit that with my iron now that it's tinned, and just to kind of flatten it out a little bit. I just grab some flux here and put it on there, and then hit this with my iron. Cool. So that's still tinned, but it's just going to be easier to put the pad on without it rocking around. So I'm going to place it, same kind of dance with the two tweezers. So I'm just going to tap the thing with my iron to heat it up, and we want to move this into place at the same time as getting it soldered to that point. Cool, and you can kind of apply pressure with the iron in the center and it will adhere down like that. One of the things I'll sometimes do too is just pre-tin that whole pad. You can see I've kind of done that over here a little bit. You can just throw some solder onto these pads beforehand and pop them off. and then it will make it that much easier to just get it to stick to where you want it. So then I would go ahead and use diode mode and check the point. This one's definitely going to be ground. So you can see that's making a connection to the via underneath it. And we can go ahead and clean it up and put solder mask on it. And from here, it's really the same kind of process I'll use for all the other ones. When you go to scrape this, we just want to be a little bit more careful and probably not scrape as much of it as the other ones, because there's no like tail on this pad that's holding it to the board in any way. So we want to leave a little bit of solder mask around the pad and attempt to just scrape the middle of it if we can. So overall, I would say not too bad. Trace repair like this doesn't really look too pretty, but it is functional and it will get the job done. Finally, I'll just come up here and get this little bit of solder off of here. Again, I'll cut my wick at like an angle like this so we can easily get in there. Boost my iron to 425 and wick up that solder. Cool, good stuff. So I'm really happy with how this turned out. Again, it doesn't look crazy pretty, but I feel confident that everything is nicely secured down to the board. So the next step is going to be to do some pad repair on the APU itself on the same corner. Now I've actually already gone ahead and fixed the pads underneath the APU, but I took a good amount of footage. I'm going to save that for another video. And while I do actually have a stencil for this, which looks like this, I made the mistake of not buying the magnetic base for it. That's going to make our life so much easier when reballing this thing. So I'm not even going to try reballing this without that. I'm going to wait until that comes in a couple weeks. So I hope that was a helpful video regarding how to go about repairing super tiny BGA pads like that. It's definitely the kind of work that takes a good amount of practice and patience, but this kind of work can be worth doing and knowing how to do in cases of data recovery work or that sort of thing. My cat is very hungry. I'll feed you in 2 minutes. I'm finishing up the video. So anyways, I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace. Are you happy the video's over so I can finally feed you? Yeah, I'm sure you are.